Well, hello everyone. I know it's been a minute since I posted a video, but I did want to give a presentation and kind of a quick how-to on a use case I had several years ago. And that use case was we had two systems that needed to talk to one another with a company that had really no technical options for implementing this additional data feed that they were needing to get into the system other than an API. And what this company had was they had what is referred to as a flat file or flat data file that the data resided on. So we didn't really have an option to spin up a database and load the data because they didn't really want to maintenance it all that much. We didn't have an option to go to the existing vendor with their application and ask for some kind of a import functionality for the flat file. So instead we just built a real quick and easy API in Python on top of a flat file. Now mind you, this will work on any kind of a data file, and this is really, if you're not used to or if you haven't really done anything with APIs in the past, this video kind of gives you a good explanation of how they work, because the misconception I think a lot of people think is APIs is this magical unicorn that exists in the sky, and and it resides and it collects data from these massive databases, and that really couldn't be further from the truth. An API is simply just an application that's dishing up this data, and this data can come from multiple sources. So today I'll show you one way with a flat file. So for starters, what we'll have is this file, and I'll bring it up here, that I actually downloaded from cms.gov for Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. This file has what they refer to as ICD codes and medical, commonly used medical codes, along with descriptions. And the idea here is that we want to be able to dish these codes up to some kind of an application through an API, and we want to give some very basic querying capabilities on this file. So we're going to want to be able to do a search that starts with the beginning of a particular code, or if they choose a different endpoint for the description lookup, to look for text within the description and return those values. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So for starters, you're going to need a few libraries. Primarily the library we're going to be using is called Flask, and we're going to want to import that into our Python project here. I'm using PyCharm. You can do this from command line if you would like as well. It's really dealer's choice. And we're going to want both the Flask and the request portions of this library. Just a quick note, we're not going to go over this with all of these, but to install libraries, I would suggest, if you haven't done this already, putting pip on your system. Pip works really well for installing such things. So if I wanted to go install Flask, for example, pip install Flask, there we go. I can do that through pip. I've already got it, so it's going to tell me that. But you can install these dependencies through pip. If you're using an IDE such as PyCharm, you can do that through some of the buttons up here as well. So we're going to want the Flask and request portions of the Flask library. We're going to want the from the Flask RESTful library, we're going to want the resource and the API portions. We're going to want from the Flask library as well JSON-pify, and we're just going to want specifically the JSONify functionality there. And we're also, I think that might be all we're wanting on this particular project. I'm just trying to think. Yeah, that should be it. If not, we'll come back and get it later. So a few things we're going to want to do to start. Let's just make a note here. We're going to go ahead and create the app, and we're just going to give it a name. So we're going to make an object here. We'll call it app, and we're going to call the Flask library that we imported above, and we are going to want to pass into it the name option here, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in our code. The next thing is we want to actually define our API, and that's going to be fairly simple because it is actually just going to be our app. So we are going to use the API library that Flask has put together. It makes it real nice and easy, and then we're going to call the app as a item that we're passing it, which is the name that was passed here above. The next thing I'd like to do is let's go ahead and just make a variable for where our flat file is. So we'll just call it the flat file we are querying. And let's just do this. This is on my desktop, so it's right here. Just quick and easy. We'll do copy and paste. A couple ways to do this. You can actually just copy and paste this in here. You could change directories beforehand. Really dealer's choice. You could have this actually in the same directory as this app and call it right from there without having to preface it here. Actually, let me just copy and paste this. Very good. And this is a TXT file. Awesome. And we're not, if you notice, we're not opening that file quite yet. We're just giving it a placeholder. We're going to do that in a different function. So the first function, because our requirement here is we want to be able to query either the code or the description, and it's really going to depend upon what we're querying, the way that we're going to execute. But really, we should be able to build an abstract enough class here to handle those requests. So first, we'll just build a very basic class that we can be used across our application for returning our data. So let's just call it return data. And this class, we're going to want to pass in the column we want to query and the query text. So what are we wanting to look for? First, let's go ahead and open the file. Important thing to note, we are going to specify this time in Python that when we open our file, our flat file, which is listed above, we are going to just read it. We do not want to put this thing in any kind of a write or a pin mode as to allocate that file so others can't reach it. Now that's important if you have an app such as this that is going to be queried constantly, because if that file is locked, the app's actually not going to be able to access it. So first things first, we're opening the file. The next thing we want to do is let's just make an object to return the items out of that file. So we'll call it return data. Oops, actually we'll call it return data. There we go. And just a simple list there. So the next thing we'd like to do is we want to iterate over this flat file that we opened right here and above. So we'll just say for each line and file open, which is our open file right up here. As you can see, it's no longer gray because we are actually calling it. We want to do a couple things. We're going to make our variables here. So the first thing is going to be our ICD code, and that's actually in the line. And if I pull that back up, what you'll see is the placement, like in my other videos. It's actually a fixed width file, right? So it's not tab delimited, it's not comma delimited, it's fixed width. So from our first position, 0, to it looks like 9 here, we're going to want to grab that data in, and then from 9 on, we'll grab the others. Now we do have some spacing there, so we can kind of play around with this, but for starters, let's just go ahead and, let's see, let me make sure, 8, 9, yep. For starters, let's just go ahead and bring this first line in. So we're going to say from position 0 to position 8, we are going to strip that, so we're going to remove any additional characters that might be there. So that'll give us a clean line. That'll be our ICD code, and then our description is going to be our line from position 8, and we can quick and easily just get the rest of the line by doing a length on the actual line, and then we're going to go ahead and take 1 off because we're started with 0 there. And once again, we're going to strip that as well to give us a clean line. The next thing is going to be our conditional statement. So up here, the column query are 2 use case scenarios, as I mentioned. If it is the ICD code, or the first column, we want it to be kind of having the wildcard at the end of the text. So if it starts with it. If it's the description, since that's a little bit more broad and a little bit more vague, we just want to see if it contains the text. So we will have 2 different conditions. So if our column to query is equal to code, which we'll pass in later, and if our ICD code that we just called here starts with the query text that we sent, then we are going to, within our return data, we are going to run the append command, and we're going to just build an object here. So the very first thing is going to be the key pair name, which in this instance is going to be the code. The next thing, we will pass it the actual ICD code that we came up with. The next thing is the description. Once again, we are going to pass it the description. Very good. And what that's going to give us is if within the code, with each line of that text, if it starts with the query text that we had sent over, it is going to meet the condition, and then it's going to put into this list this small object that has the code in the description that will be returned later. The second condition that we need to do, and actually we can just kind of copy and paste this here, is if that equals description, and if the actually we're going to need to change this. So if it starts with description, and if the query text is in the description, we're actually going to put to lower as well, because if they, we don't want to really enforce the case sensitiveness here. So essentially, is if the query text they sent us for the description, which is just an in statement, it's kind of a wild card on both sides. If it is included in the description, it's lowercase, then, and actually here too, we want to do this query text lower as well. If it's in that, then we want to, once again, we can just copy and paste this, return the data just as we did above. All right, very good. So after that, let's go back up to where we're out of our iteration of our file open object. We want to go ahead now and return our return data. And the library we used above, JSONify, is a very good library to use to take a library or a list object and turn it into a JSON object for us with very little effort. So there's our return data. It's going to be passed there. Very good. So start to finish, here's our return data function that we will be using here in one moment. I'm going to go ahead and minimize that for now so that we can work on our actual routes here. So since we built such an abstract class for returning our data, our routes are going to be very, very basic in this example that I'm giving you here. So the very first thing we want to make is the class to query codes. So let's just call the class codes and resource, which is going back to our Flask RESTful objects we have up here. We are calling this a resource within our API, just as it would be a resource in other languages APIs as well. So we're going to make our function, our get function. We're going to get our self, which is our resource that we are on currently, and then we want to also pass the code prefix. And that is actually going to be on our API, kind of the querying mechanism at the end of the code. And that will make more sense whenever we bring up the object here at the end. So all we need to do, since we've already built a pretty abstract class, is we can just call return, our return data, which is our function that we built above. We're going to pass it code, and we're going to pass it the code prefix that we made there. Now, as you can see, code there, here's our condition here, right? So we have our condition, and then we have our route or our resource that we have here that we're specifying it so it meets that condition, so that it knows on this one, look at the beginning of the lines on just that ICD code. So very good. Like I said, it's just that basic since we made that abstract class above, which is what will help us out quite a bit here. So class to query descriptions, we will do next. So class descriptions, yeah, let's just call it that. Resource, once again, we are going to make our function here. We're going to go ourself, and we are going to say our text and description this time, because this time we're actually wanting to pull in data to look for in the text of the description itself. Okay, very good. Just like before, it's going to look like a very similar statement that we had, other than we're actually going to be pulling in description this time, or passing that to our function that we made above. Then once again, text and description, which we're passing there. Very good. So once again, description, going back up to our function that we made. It's going to meet this condition if it matches, and we'll be off to the races. So the very last things that we need to do here is we actually just need to add these resources. And what we'll do is we'll say, for example, here's our codes resource we just made here, and we are going to tell it what the endpoint is. So on this one, we'll just say codes. And if you recall up here, we had code prefix that we passed. We're going to get that by using these little guys here and putting code prefix in. So essentially it's going to replace, it's going to map this that is passed by the user to this. Very good. The next thing we're going to want to add is, once again, our API.add resource description this time, or descriptions. Then we'll give it the description endpoint along with the text and description, and that out. Very good. So now we have our resources mapped to our routes. Here are our resources that are defined, and they're calling this function that we made that is opening this flat file and querying it. The very last thing we need to do is we need to build in just a line of code here so that it will run, the actual API will run. So above, if you recall, we made our name option up here, which is our flask object. And we're going to say if this equals main, which this main function, or this main call that we're doing, is actually a Python specific one that would allow us to, let's just say, save this file and run it on the background through like like a command prompt of sorts. We could run it here local. It'll allow us to just run this app without having to come in here and click play every time. Is really a watered down way of saying that. So we're essentially just saying, okay, if it equals main, then we are going to run our app, which encompasses our Flask portion here, and also has our API, and we're going to run it, and the only thing we need to specify is a port. So I'm going to specify port 4123. And what do I have going? Oh, yeah, I'm missing a. Very good. So, cross your fingers if everything works correctly. What you're going to see is that our program is running. Now, I will tell you that we're going to get a not found because we don't have any routes for our default route that we have set up in here. We just did a very basic explanation. But if I were to call codes in A1, what you would see then, and I could show you in the file too, is codes that start with A1. If I wanted codes that started with A188, it's going to be much more defined. Also, like our description, we can put text that's in there. For example, that looks odd enough. Actually, let's do this guy. If I was to put this in here, once again, it's going to find anything that has that in the description. So once again, just looking at the two, there's our description. It's taking our text and description, which is post procedural in this example. That is then getting passed into our API, or from our app into our API, which then goes into our resource. In this particular resource, it's mapped to descriptions. Descriptions is then calling return data and passing description in along with this text that was passed from the API, which is then meeting this criteria and returning us these JSON objects. So I know that was a lot in a very short amount of time. Truth be told, there's a lot of work to do to put something like this into production. There's some error checking and some other return codes we'd want to do. I just wanted to give you a very brief overview on how these things work and some ways to maybe get your brain thinking on some possible integrations that may be very specific that you may be able to conquer now given some of these technologies. So thank you very much and have a good night.